kiss, one single kiss. The face outside, window pane. However did it come to this? The use of force, he was so tough. She'll soon submit, she's had enough. March of fate, broken will. Someone is lying very still. He has laughed and he has cried. He has fought and he has died. It's just the same as all the rest. He's not the worst and he's not the best.
Hello everybody, welcome to the agenda. We'll call this episode number 3. Number 1 featured Andreas Poller. It's not actually on my YouTube now, but I'll get it on YouTube later, Andreas. Number 2 was supposed to be with the father in the AB versus CD case, where this father has basically been forced by the state to facilitate his child's gender transition. And I broke this story. I wrote the first published story on this and was the first person to interview the father in this case. And my story was published really just as the father was beginning to seek legal recourse. So there were no court orders or anything in place at that time. I was prevented from conducting my interview with the father by the BC Supreme Court. Basically, the other side of this debate, who I'm going to argue are representatives of the medical pharmaceutical complex, came in with their team of lawyers and legal assistants, 3 lawyers and probably 4 or 5 legal assistants. And then the father, who we'll call Clark, Laura Lynn Tyler Thompson, and myself. Laura Lynn and I were accused of breaching or being in breach of a publication ban that prohibited using the name of the father and using the names of the doctors involved. There were, or at least I made some arguments and debated whether or not that publication ban should apply to Facebook, and there's still some questions that remain unresolved there. In any case, I did a live stream on Saturday night that was designed to basically recap what was going on. What I found was that it was very difficult for me to not sort of automatically spit out the name of the father who I've come to know fairly well, or the name of the doctors who I've come to, let's see, what's the word I'm looking for here? I guess despise is the right word, okay, because what they're doing is wrong. But in any case, I wanted to discuss the details of that, and I wanted to do it in a way that complied with the Supreme Court's order against me. So I believe the intent behind that order is fundamentally opposed to the interests of British Columbia and ultimately to Canada and maybe to much of the world. So I'm not complying with the order because I agree with it or because I'm submitting. I'm complying with that order on social media and digital media, like here on YouTube, simply because the other side has the power to silence me on social media, although I'm sort of silenced now anyway. I'll get into that maybe a little later. I will include some clips from the live broadcast, minus information that sort of slipped out that was potentially identifying, including a first name of the father, but it's a real stretch to think that somebody out there who doesn't already know who the father is going to be able to take this first name and link it up to the father and therefore link it up to the child. Okay, so my argument has been all along that I'm not interested in naming the child in this case. I'm not interested in naming the mother in this case. I'm only interested in naming the father because it's of critical public interest for him to be known, for his face to be known, and for his name to be known. He needs to be humanized because there's a real power in that. So let me just give you a recap of what transpired. It was actually a busy week for me. I ended up, at the time of the court case, I ended up going 36 hours with only 2 hours sleep. And that's because I had a bunch of things sort of piling on top of each other. I just got through with this thing at UBC where they had their academic freedom under threat panel, which specifically named me as one of the types of speakers that they didn't think should be allowed to speak on university campuses. And of course they assembled a panel to sort of rubber stamp that idea, and they, made false characterizations of me, deceptive characterizations of me, so I had to sort of deal with that. And you can see on my channel I ended up making a statement to the members of the panel, a video statement. Now, early in the week, I was made aware of the fact that Press Progress had published an article on what happened at UBC and the whole question of who should and should not be allowed to speak at UBC. And of course, they ran with the same sort of nonsense that I'm a right-wing extremist. And I see Morgan Auger has once again been pushing this idea that I'm a right-wing extremist, which is false. It is egregiously false. It is a lie, and as wrong as can be. I am not right-wing at all. I have described myself repeatedly as a democratic socialist, essentially. Perhaps you could say I'm a left-leaning libertarian in the tradition of Noam Chomsky, who has been the primary intellectual influence in my life. Okay? Nobody in their right mind would describe Noam Chomsky as right-wing. But these people aren't interested in the truth, so they published this article portraying me this way and sort of reinforcing the false notions that have been spread about me, particularly by the UBC Students Against Bigotry. So I ended up having to basically do damage control and defend myself and respond to some of the slanders were out there. And it was important to me because Press Progress has a circulation of 250,000 people through all of their different means of communication. So it was important for me to do damage control, and I ended up in numerous sort of jousting matches trying to clarify people on exactly who I am, and more importantly, what I represent and what I'm trying to do. So I was just sort of at the tail end of this battle to try to repair the damage done by press progress, and suddenly I started getting by email notices from lawyers. Now, I was unaware, completely unaware, prior to that time, that lawyers are permitted in certain circumstances to basically serve you with papers by email. I had no idea. I had just had an email prior to getting the first one from the lawyers. I'd had an email from somebody claiming to represent Revenue Canada, and that I owed X amount of dollars, and that I needed to pay up immediately, and that I needed to pay to their new outsourced office in Nigeria. Okay, so when I get emails from people claiming to be authority figures, I tend to ignore them. So the initial notification that I got from the first lawyer, I kind of ignored, kind of joked about it a bit, and questioned whether or not they really were lawyers. But over the course of the day, which was Tuesday, I started getting more and more notices from different lawyers. I got pages and pages and pages of documents from lawyers representing AB, which is the teenager in question in the AB versus CD case. I got notice from the lawyer that represents one of the doctors, the psychologist basically, that was involved in the case, and I got a notification from the lawyer that represents the endocrinologist who was involved at the Children's Hospital, and I got a legal notice from a lawyer representing the provincial government, basically. So basically 4 different people seeking orders against me to prevent me from speaking certain things in the public. So by this point it became obvious that, okay, so it seems that I'm dealing with something real here, and they're seeking to silence me. Now what they were alleging was that I was in breach of the publication ban on the AB versus CD case, which stipulates that neither the father nor the child nor the mother nor the doctors involved could be named using their real names in any publication. Now, over the course of the bulk of my life, I have always understood a publication ban to refer to radio, television, newspapers, magazines, these types of things, right? Professional publications that have, significant circulation. So when I got the copy of the court order, which I had not looked at previously, the first thing I did was take a look at the publication ban section of the order. I looked, as I usually will when we're dealing with legal documents, I looked for definitions, and there were no definitions, right? I wanted a definition of publication ban and what that entails and encompasses and means, but there was no definition of publication ban, or even what constitutes a publication itself. So looking at the actual text of the publication ban, social media like Facebook and Twitter, and digital media like YouTube was not specifically cited in the order, so it was unclear. Now, Mark Zuckerberg has testified recently to, I think it was Congress, either Congress or the Senate. He testified that Facebook, as far as Facebook Corporation is concerned, is not a media source. Okay, it's not a publication. It is a technology company that allows people to communicate. So it allows groups of friends to come together and communicate as a group online. So whether or not that really constitutes publication is somewhat debatable. At least it was somewhat debatable to me prior to getting this order. But in any case, they had, by hook or possibly by crook, managed to get what they call short leave. So basically that is doing away with the usual protocols, procedures, and due process necessary to get a court order against somebody, and basically drag us into court within 12 hours really of me sort of getting the final notices and stuff. So it was really, there was no time to prepare, let alone acquire the services of a lawyer if that was something that I wanted to do. So what I'll do right here is I'll just cut away to the video from my live stream broadcast on Saturday night for a description of what happened in the actual courtroom. It's been quite a week. A lot of stuff going on this week. And then, of course, at the tail end of the week, I ended up being censored on Facebook. And all of this censorship is, well, it's to me, it's depressing. So I went into a bit of a depression yesterday when I found out that my Facebook had been suspended for 30 days. We had this troll show up on my thread and comment on one of my posts that my activities with the father in the AB versus CD case constituted outing a child. So, I mean, I don't sort of like comments like that, so I called them a clown, a circus clown or something like that. And that apparently was enough to get me suspended for 30 days on both of my accounts. Ironically, and coincidentally, it just happens to be 24 hours after I was in court and slapped with an order, a court order, in terms of what I can say and what I can't say when I'm publishing. And it also came coincidentally exactly 1 month prior to my talk tour, which means for the entire time between the Facebook ban and my first date of my talk tour, I will essentially have no way to advertise, except for maybe YouTube. And that was very discouraging to me. Okay, so I lose my 2,400 contacts. I will lose my ability to communicate with people. And this particular talk tour is important. Yeah. So it makes, because the newspapers won't allow me to place ads. Okay, so the two biggest newspaper chains in British Columbia, Post Media, which is supposed to be hero, National Post, supposed to be this champion hero for truth. Post Media, that company, will not allow me to advertise in their newspaper. Black Press, which controls the vast majority of newspapers in BC, will not allow me to place ads. So the way I'd been advertising in the past was on the web via social media, primarily Facebook. And now that's been taken away from me too. And the other censorship problems are just trying to rent a venue. Okay, now I want to rent public venues. I don't really want to rent private venues. Private venues are very unpredictable. They can back out at the last moment for any number of reasons. Public venues are supposed to be accessible to everybody in the public, but I have to, every time I want to rent a public venue these days, it seems like I have to get into a wrestling match. So the venue that we're working on right now, Simon Fraser University, we've been arm wrestling with the Simon Fraser University going back and forth now for weeks and weeks and weeks. And they had to call a board meeting, and it's just crazy. I mean, and you kind of get that. I mean, most people, when they do talks, so like if Morgan Auger wants to do a talk, he just goes and he rents a venue and it's done. But for me, it's not that way. If I want to rent a public venue, there's going to be a huge exchange and back and forth for weeks, and they got to call board meetings and have discussions about it, and then there's even more discussions about what charges that they're going to give me in terms of like security fees and stuff like that. And all of this back and forth and all of this arrangement stuff takes time and energy away from what we could be doing otherwise. So all of this censorship is crippling. And then of course we've got the media too. And I've been trying to explain to people for a long time how the media operates, right? And I've been trying to explain why they've been trying to turn me into an invisible person. And it's because my arguments are powerful and I come with stats and figures. I know how to approach this argument. They'd rather have someone like Laura Lynn, who's just sort of more all emotion and being bombastic and stuff like that, which has its place. And I'm not going to say that she, doesn't have a role in all of this. She can certainly play a role in all of this, but I'm quite different. Okay, so I'm university trained. I was what I would call a top debater when I was in university. So I know how to play by academic rules, and I know what the expectations are on the other side. And ultimately, when this gets in, like if we get this into an inquiry, we get this into some sort of legal situation, you can't just sort of spew things, right? And you can't exaggerate things, and you can't, you can't go like way over the top. You've got to, like, you can put emotion into what you're doing and emotion into what you're saying and deliver it using good prose and language. But your information has to be solid, right? Because the other side is going to take it apart. Okay, so if you're saying things that are incorrect, they're going to come after you. Okay, because the other side will pick everything apart. And so I'm always very careful about the information. And because I'm always very careful and measured when I'm talking to the media or when I'm talking to like the court the other day, this is the kind of stuff that the media doesn't want out there, because I have structured, powerful arguments. So when we saw Post Media cover what happened in court the other day, they took my picture and acknowledged that I was present, but all of the startling statistics that I gave to them and that I presented to the court were not quoted anywhere in the article. Okay, that could have significantly changed the people's understanding of what is going on in this case, but they once again did not quote me. I think they felt like they had to acknowledge my existence, so they took my picture outside the courtroom. But beyond that, I was almost a non-factor. And it's not just the mainstream media, okay? So it's media who claims to be on our side, like this activist mummy in Australia, I think it is. Okay, she publishes a story on it, and I don't exist in the story, right? The reason we were in court was because of publications stuff that Laura Lynn and I published and that had done on his own. And that's why we were in court. But I didn't exist at all for activist mummy. So this is sort of the problem that I'm dealing with, is that I've got a media that either wants to demonize me or pretend I don't exist. And then I've got all of these other disadvantages in terms of, like I say, renting venues and being able to advertise and stuff. And I've been putting, like, I've poured my heart and my lifeblood into this for, I think next month will make 3 years that I've been in this. So I've been pouring everything I have into this. And the March 14th date, for instance, was sort of like, okay, this is it. This is my big push to force government to make a change. And I had all of my sort of attention and energy directed on that event. And then, we have all of this stuff that went on this week. And then my last means of being able to advertise was taken from me for the entire time leading up to my event. And yeah, I fell into a depression. But that's not the first time it's happened. But let's look at what happened over the course of the week. We'll review that, talk about some of the details and the significance of what happened, talk about some of the stuff that's going on with Laura Lynn, kind of clear that up as much as I can. The father began doing these interviews online, okay? So he did one with Frank Vaughn, who's a PPC or was a PPC candidate. He did one with Laura Lynn, and he was scheduled to do one with me. And that's basically, I think, when we saw the other side kick into full motion. In any case, I got all of these notices that they were seeking a court order against me. So initially, it was kind of short notice. Like that was one of the things about this. It was a short leave, what they call short leave. So basically, the normal legal procedures and protocols are sort of taken out of the way, and it's rushed into court because it's apparently that urgent, right? And they had sort of like a secret meeting where they determined that short leave was going to be applicable in this case. And the very fact that they didn't get their court order until about 2 hours before the broadcast was about to occur between myself and the father, I think is an indication that I think they were really concerned. Okay, first of all, they didn't like that he was out there giving interviews and stuff in the first place, and so they could see that this was a dangerous trend. But I think when I came into the equation, that's really alarmed them, because I've been sort of the most vocal opponent of child transitioning in BC over the last, most vocal and active. And I would argue, well, I approach it differently than other people. Okay, so like the difference between Laura Lynn and I, right? She's sort of like, she's an evangelist turned politician, and now she's on to this subject. So she's got sort of a, I don't know how to describe it. She's got a more animated way of approaching things, and she's always looking to like constantly push buttons, and that's the way an evangelist works, right? So that's probably fairly effective in the Christian community, but once you get out of the Christian community, then you need a more structured approach, and that's what I've sort of always represented. Okay, again, back to my education, that I know all of the requirements in an academic debate. So they were worried, I think, that when Bob and I got together, I think boy, this is tough. I mean, Clark. His name is Clark. That's his name. His name is Clark. Just forget what I said before. His name is Clark. They're terrified that Clark and I will get together at some point, because I think like Clark's story is powerful and important, and everybody needs to hear about it, and it needs to be a subject for open public discussion. It's a very important case. I've described Clark's case as the most important case of its kind in Canada, at least, perhaps in the world. Okay, it may be the most important case of its kind in the world, right? And when you combine that with what I've been doing, and not just what I've been doing, but the way I've been doing it, and some of the startling statistics and numbers that I bring to the table, when you combine those two together, I think the other side of this debate is terrified of us uniting forces and somehow being able to thrust ourselves into the public eye. So they scrambled to get this court order in place just before the actual interview was scheduled to take place. But they pushed aside all normal procedures and due process, right? So didn't have any time to prepare. So we went to the court. And I was a little naive. I thought it said, okay, 9:45, scheduled for 2 hours. Great, I'll be out of there by 11:45, and I can be home by 1:30 or something. Well, that was not to be. The thing ended up taking all day long, and the defense, basically myself, Laura Lynn, and Clark, did not get to speak until like way late in the day. There was like a 36-hour period there because of the way things sort of unfolded, where I only had like about 2 hours sleep. So I was in the court kind of operating on fumes. Yeah, so Sharon's talking about defending the doctors, and we'll get into that whole question of the doctors. Because that is a big one, and these two doctors in question are very important. And the way that they're censoring me in this regard is disturbing. And their whole argument, I would say, is weak. So basically the argument was that we have, all three of us in different ways have breached the publication ban that was in place on this. Our only initial defense is, well, we're not really aware of the details of the publication ban. That wasn't my defense. My defense was that I wasn't sure that it applied to social media, or that it should apply to social media. But the judge clarified me on that. The setting was actually kind of interesting, because neither Clark, Laura Lynn, or myself came with legal counsel. It was just us, right? And on the other side, you have this crowd. I don't know how many people were over there. Maybe 6 to 8 different people, including 3 lawyers, who were basically seeking the orders against us. So it was, this legal team versus us. So that was interesting. I also found it interesting that it seemed like everybody, or just about everybody on the other side, were all women, right? And that's interesting. Like all 3 lawyers were female. There's something sort of kind of ironic and apropos about that too, because it was, in the case of, in Clark's case, it was the mother who really sort of wanted to push this transition thing through. So it seems to be that's usually the way. It's when you've got family situations like this, it's typically not the father who's pushing for transition. It's almost always the mother who's pushing for transition and the father resisting it. Now, that's an interesting phenomenon. I don't know how we can really account for that, except to say that maybe women are more susceptible to being politically correct. I don't know. Yes, the Kanis Foundation, I will explain that, and the name, I'll explain that too. Yeah, there are a lot of loopholes in this this case, and a lot of things that were ambiguous. So in the court order where they put the publication ban in place, I've looked at a lot of different court orders and papers and stuff, and a lot of the ones that I looked at actually started with definitions, right? And this court order didn't have a definition. So when I read the description of the publication ban, it wasn't clear to me. I went looking for the definition of publication ban and publication, what constitutes a publication. They had no definitions, which I think is a major overlook on their part. So that's how I questioned it. And this issue of Facebook media. Now the judge, okay, now keep in mind this is a Supreme Court judge, and he has basically said that a publication ban applies to Facebook. That's interesting. I wonder if Mark Zuckerberg is aware of this, and whether Mark Zuckerberg might want to contest the fact that this judge has basically determined Facebook to constitute a publication, like it's a publication media. There is a debate to be had there. I've got a private SOGI123 group on Facebook. That, I think, is still one of those real gray areas, and I don't know if any publication ban should apply to such groups because they're private. Okay, so what was the case law he cited for his ruling? Well, this is part of the whole thing. So when the court case, and you guys will have to forgive me, I didn't style my hair today, but when it started, when the hearing started, I stood up immediately, and I should say right off the bat about Carrie Simpson. Okay, so first thing is, let's be clear that Carrie Simpson is no longer directly associated with Clark. Okay, she's not representing him in terms of collecting money for his legal expenses and that type of stuff. He's doing that himself. I was just about to set up a GoFundMe page to help pay for some of the, like we were ordered to pay expenses. I was going to try to set up a fund to try to raise money for that, but then bingo, I got my Facebook killed, so I couldn't do that. But again, just to be clear, Clark is on his own right now. Okay, so he's representing himself right now. Carrie's not representing him. So if you want to help him in terms of helping pay for his costs to fight this dragon, I'll call it a dragon, that's the state. It's like a three-headed hydra monster, basically. But if you want to support him, he's setting up a GoFundMe page. We just have to sort of come to some sort of clarity on the language that's used on that GoFundMe page, because we got to make sure that his name doesn't appear anywhere, and that the language is also phrased in such a way that it doesn't connect directly to the case, because if any of that is present, the other side of this argument will just petition GoFundMe to shut down the GoFundMe account. And so that wouldn't do any good. But once we get sort of the language clarified for that, I'll release, and I'm sure Chris and some other people will release, and I'm sure Sharon and other people would be willing to do that too. We'll release a link to his GoFundMe page where the money will go directly to him, not through a middle person, you know, not through a culture guard, not through me, not through Laura Lynn, directly to him. That's the way it should be. Because then you know who's getting the money, right? And who's using the money, and then it's going where it's supposed to go, right? So we'll get into that. But on the subject of Carrie Simpson, she is still obviously on the ground, focused on this issue. And she was at the courthouse there. And even though Carrie and I kind of get into disputes from time to time and have arguments and big fights and stuff, she was actually very helpful to me. She went out of her way to share her legal knowledge with me. I don't have any legal knowledge. I know how to do arguments, right? I know how to, like, I can function, I think, very well in the role of a lawyer when it comes to arguing my case. That I don't have any problem with. It's the sort of procedures and protocols and stuff that I'm not familiar with, and what I'm allowed to do and what I'm not allowed to do in the sort of legal context. So Carrie gave me a whole lot of advice in that regard, and I appreciate that advice. So the first thing that I did there, based on my discussions with Carrie, was I wanted to question the short leave. So this is this thing where we weren't given due notice. We weren't given the usual notice, which is, I don't know, 7 to 10 days or something like that. I don't know what it is. But this is clearly way short notice. So I stood up right away and said, Your Honor, or whatever. Actually, there's a different term that everybody was using. I think it was lordship or something. I use those terms like Your Honor and Your Lordship and stuff like that, but I have real trouble using those words. Those words just annoy the hell out of me, because this is just a guy, and it's like being forced or expected to say Your Honor or Your Lordship is almost forcing me to submit to their superiority when I regard them just as human beings, right? And if we're going to debate the issue, let's debate this issue on even ground. Yes, you have the authority. You don't have to tell me that. I know that you've got the power of the state behind you. But when we're debating the actual issues, let's keep this as level as possible. So those words really bother me. Yeah, well, anyway, so I used the title, and I said, Your Lordship, if I may just bring up some preliminary matters before we go on. And he let me talk, and I said, okay, so I think the first thing that we need to look at is this short leave. I don't accept this short leave. I think that this is all too much of a rush for me. I don't actually have them handy, but they gave me 3 big binders of information and documents, right? And there was more in the emails and stuff. So there's this huge pile of documentation, and I held up this pile of documents and I said, so this was just given to me yesterday. Like, a lot of it I didn't get until late in the day yesterday. I haven't had any chance to review this myself, let alone acquire the services of a lawyer. Now, when they are trying to get a court order to silence me from doing what I do as a political activist, that's very serious. And I think that I deserve to have either legal representation, or I deserve to have time to properly prepare, to study what they're arguing, look at some precedents, and make some sort of, intelligent argument, and give some, high-powered justifications to refute their claim that they need to silence me. But he basically just hand-waved that all away. No, sorry, it doesn't matter. Yeah, it doesn't matter that you didn't have time. It doesn't matter that you didn't have a lawyer. I'm putting words in his mouth here, but that's essentially what his ruling was. So I had to sit down and wait for my time to respond to the request for an order against me. So it sort of went on and on and on and on. And keep in mind, at this point, I'm running on fumes. I've got like 2 hours sleep, but I have to listen to all these long, boring speeches, and they've got their team that's been assembled on the other side to address the different things. In my case, the things that they were focusing on were my posts on Facebook, where I used the father's real name. I didn't use the daughter's name. I didn't use the mother's name. I've never used their names. In fact, when the National Post wanted to publish all of this information before there were any court orders, I went out of my way to implore the National Post not to publish the names of the mother, and especially the child in the case. Yeah, so there was the Facebook post that they wanted to force me to remove. I have essentially removed all of those that I'm aware of. If I'm missing anything and the legal team is out there, do let me know and point me to which post is in violation. And if I can, I'll delete it, because I'm suspended. I don't even know if I can delete posts. But so I've tried to comply. So that was part of their action against me. The other part of their action was my advertising that I was going to be interviewing Clark. And they wanted to get that removed and to basically get an order prohibiting me from conducting that interview. The other thing, one of the most curious things was, and there's two different sections of this. So I published an article in December of 2018 on Clark's case. It was the first publication on this story anywhere. It was subsequently published by the Post Millennial, basically a national alt media site. But I published it simultaneously on my blog and with the Post Millennial. And this is before any court cases had ruled that there should be, a publication ban or whatever. In that article, once again, I did not name the child in the case. I used a pseudonym, but I did use the names of the two doctors in question, okay, who I am prohibited from saying in this broadcast, okay? But if people go and do a little research, you can find out the names of these people quite easily. I've been talking about these doctors in public for a very long time. So anybody who's heard me speak over the last couple of years in public will already know who these doctors are, particularly the one doctor who I regard as dangerous to children. I think that particular doctor should be under at least review by the College of Psychologists or under criminal investigation. One of the two things. I believe it's that serious with that doctor. In any case, so in that story from December of 2018, I named the doctors. The court case, I believe at that time, had just started filing papers in the court, and it wasn't actually anywhere yet. So it's been there, it's been online since that time. Initially, they isolated that story and told me that that story was in violation of the publication ban on this case. And I basically said that, you know, this was published before any orders. Okay, it's part of my work as a political activist trying to oppose this insanity. So I think that that article should just stay right where it is. And insisting that I get rid of it is unreasonable. Sharon says criminal charges are better for docs because they are under self-governing bodies. Yeah, and the problem with those self-governing bodies, Sharon, is they tend to be saturated in big pharma conflicts of interest. So expecting, it's kind of like expecting a police office to investigate themselves in an honest way, right? They're going to defend each other and they're going to defend their interests. So it has to be a neutral body that does the investigating. And that's what we need to happen in the case of these doctors. They need to be subjects of provincial, national inquiries, as do any other doctors who are doing the same work, because of the information that's come to light that this doctor himself released to the public, right? When I got the information that this doctor released, I was alarmed. And that actually was a moment where I knew, if you want to believe in, you know, that there's a force in the universe that moves the right people to the right place at the right time. That revelation by that doctor made me believe that I am almost cosmically meant to be in this battle, because I was a foster child, right? And he deals with so many foster children and stuff. And when I took a look at the numbers and stuff, I was beyond shocked. Right? I was I was stunned about the percentages of foster kids who were identifying as transgender and under the care of just one doctor, right? But they wanted to get that article removed because I mentioned the names of the doctors. But by the time I got into court, the different lawyers approached me before the court case and said to me that they wanted to just be clear that they've decided that they're not going to try to get that article itself removed. But what they said they were going to do was they were going to require me to remove all links to that article that I have on my Facebook or any other public forum, and prohibit me from linking to my own work, right? So I put a lot of time and energy into that story, right? I actually traveled to meet and did an interview with Clark. Sorry, I don't know why I keep calling him. His name is Clark. There's something going on in my head here. His name is Clark. I keep going with this other name. I don't know why. Anyway, I traveled to meet him, right? And I spent an awful lot of time researching that article, writing that article. When I went to get it published with the Post-Millennial, that was a sort of a tennis match too, because I had to go back and forth with them in terms of what they were willing to publish and what they weren't willing to publish. And eventually, after several exchanges and rewrites, the article was published with the Post-Millennial. But the thing is that this article is part of my work. It's part of what I'm doing to try to affect public policy and try to get these inquiries, right? So what they're doing now is they are ordering me to basically to prohibit me from referring to my own labor and my own work over the years. Say, you're not allowed to point anybody to your work. So I thought that was a little draconian, okay? But anyway, that's what it was. So the way that the defense, if you will, functioned in this is that Laura Lynn went first, and Laura Lynn gave a pretty good speech to the judge in a Laura Lynn kind of a way, right? Which is animated, emotional. It's funny because she claims that I'm emotional. I don't deny it, but she was sort of describing me being emotional as if it's some sort of bad thing. But she was doing this emotional speech to the judge, and it was a good speech. And I don't think that she said much that I would have disagreed with. We were sitting at the table there. Clark and I were sitting at the table there, and I decided that I wanted to speak after Laura Lynn. So I asked Clark, do you mind if I respond before you? And Clark said, no, that's fine. You can go ahead. But once Laura Lynn was done, and she basically I mean, she spoke strong, but she sort of deferred to the authority of the court. But when it came time for Clark to speak, the judge said, well, I think, or no, for me to speak, the judge said, well, I think I want to hear Clark first. So he altered the order that we had structured. And so Clark went up to give his defense. And in his defense, it was very interesting to watch. It was a very good experience for me. This whole case really is important. And being there in the courtroom helped, and this is part of my argument that I made, okay? So helped humanize Clark to me, okay? Rather than being some phantom fictional character or some letters floating around in space, here we have a real human being with a real name who is being subjected to enormous pressure from the state to conform with something that he doesn't believe in. So anyway, he made his arguments about the court order and stuff, and kind of acknowledged that he was in breach, and that the court was basically giving him one final warning not to breach the court order again. The judge also scolded Clark for referring to his child as, referring to his child as the sex the child was born, and suggested that it was malicious for Clark to be referring to his child as the sex that the child was born. And Clark tried to explain that he said, well, it's not something like that I'm doing deliberately. It's just like I've had this child in my life since the child was born, and I've always understood this child to be the sex that the child is. And you don't just flick a switch and suddenly automatically, it's like me here being restrained from using the name of somebody I know, right? I'm not allowed to use his name. And so it's very difficult. My brain goes into autopilot and I just sort of say what I know, right? And that was the same thing with Clark. And that was his argument. It's like, listen, my brain is trained to use this word because I know the truth, and I'm trying to speak it. And the judge basically concluded that he understood that there were some sort of automatic errors, I guess, being made, but that he thought it was that Clark was being deliberately malicious, and he needed to stop it because part of the conduct order that's been put upon him is that he refers to his daughter. Was it daughter, son? It's all so confusing. Son, daughter, he, she, him. Everything's so confusing nowadays, right? But anyway, he insisted that he not refer to his daughter or son or whatever by their biological sex, or in a way that gave their biological sex. And when the judge basically reiterated that he needed to follow all of the conditions of the publication ban and the conduct order, right? And the judge wanted to make sure that he understood these things and understood and would concede and admit that he would honor the orders against him. And that's where it all got really real for me, if you will, okay? Because the father in this case has been under enormous pressure, okay? People, I don't know if people can imagine what kind of pressure it is to have something like this happen, where you have a child who's born, let's say, female, and now identifies as male, and has this sort of medical pharmaceutical LGBT activist complex assemble behind the child to say that, yes, this child now identifies as male, therefore the child is male, and if you say anything opposite, well, then you're basically committing a crime. At least in Clark's case, that's the way it was. And the question is, has Clark been threatened with jail? Well, Clark has been threatened with being in contempt of court, basically. What that usually means is either a fine, or if you don't pay the fine, it means jail time. So that's the way that would work if they want to go to that route. But then how could they still say that they're protecting the child? It's important and powerful to humanize somebody in a situation like this. Okay? Like, again, just for them to be letters or some phantom name doesn't carry the same power or make it as real for people as when you got a real person, a real face, a real name. That makes it real for everybody. But that moment in the courtroom where we had the judge basically demanding under threat of state power that he abide by these orders, that's when you saw this Clark, who's been under all these pressures, wavering, and like you could see him wavering under the pressure because he knows that he wants to speak. Like, this is totally an Orwellian moment, right? Totally an Orwellian moment, because it's just like that scene in 1984 where Winston is being forced to say that
only the disciplined mind can see reality, Winston. It needs an act of self-destruction, an effort of the will. Do you remember writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 4?
Yes.
How many fingers am I holding up, Winston?
4.
And if the party says there are not 4, but 5, then how many?
5.
No. That's no use. You're lying. How many fingers, please?
4. What else can I say? 5, 4, anything you like. Only please stop it. Stop the pain. How can I help it? How can I help when I see her under my eyes? 2 and 2 makes 4.
Sometimes, Winston. Sometimes they're 5. Sometimes they're 3. Sometimes they're all of them at once. Neither the past, nor the present, nor the future exists in its own right, Winston. Reality is in the human mind, not in the individual mind, which makes mistakes and soon perishes, but in the mind of the party.
Trying to force Winston to speak this lie, and Winston didn't want to speak the lie, so they were zapping him, trying to, until he would finally speak the lie, but more than speak the lie, come to believe the lie. And this scene in the courtroom was that, okay? It could have been in 1984. Here you've got a father who knows what his child is. Right? He knows this. It's not just like an ideological thing. This is a fact. He knows the truth. And yet he's got this all-powerful state standing in front of him saying, confirm for me here and now that you will submit. Right? Otherwise, all of the power of the state will be brought down upon you, right? And everything that they can do. And so as a normal human being would, you know, there you are. You're in this situation where you know what the truth is. You want and believe that you have a right to speak the truth. But you also know that the state has the power to destroy your life, and they can destroy it right now. Okay, so here he is in this impossible situation, right? And I could see him wavering under that pressure, and that just made it so sort of human for me, right? And it just sort of, I always knew that we're involved in a very sort of insidious and dangerous thing in terms of human freedom. But that moment in itself was just sort of took it to the next level, right? And really humanized the father for me, and really made me feel more of a kinship and more of a duty to sort of stand up and do the right thing. So the judge basically got him to concede that he would follow the court orders, including the conduct order. But I could tell that he didn't want to do that, but he's under threat of the state. So now was my turn to speak. And so that made it even more real for me. I did not have any time to prepare to launch what I would call a full defense and arguments, not just for my right to speak and publish and to use the actual name of the father, but I had like I felt a duty to sort of reinforce the insanity of or pointing out the insanity of what the court is doing. So as fate would have it, it was perfect that we had the father stand up before me and have the state sort of coming down on him and putting all of this pressure on him to speak the lie and confirm that he will speak the lie. And he had to sort of save his own skin, and by some ways to save his own daughter, because if he gets sent off to jail or something, he's not going to be able to be there for his daughter, son, whatever. Let's see, there we go again. The only reason I conform to what the state asks of me is because they have the power to kill my social media accounts, okay? When we get outside of social media and you get me on the street, okay, if that judge had ordered me to speak a lie, I would not have spoken a lie, okay? I would refuse to do that. But the fact that Clark, I don't know, I just keep slipping, Clark had been bullied in this way right before me was perfect. So I went up in front of the judge, having not prepared at all. And I said, I think in order to understand this case and why I need to be allowed to talk, I need to provide some context. And then I said, one of the most insidious things that a totalitarian state can do is to force its citizens to speak a lie. And this is just one aspect of this case that illustrates the enormous public interest involved in this case. It's more than just about one family or one man. This is about every family and about everybody. So it's a critically important case. The other side of this debate, who I would argue represents the medical pharmaceutical complex, would have you believe and would have the public believe that this is just a case of one little family and it's just a little tiny family matter. And so everybody, you know, all of these bans about information and privatizing and anonymizing everything is just keeping with traditions in terms of privacy around family matters. But the implications of this case are so huge and so enormous, I believe that it is of enormous public interest. Okay, so it's not the way they're trying to characterize it, just one little family private matter, and let's silence all discussion of it because it's nobody's business but the family, right? So I said, no, this is an issue of enormous public interest, and I, as a public activist who is trying to get an inquiry into what is happening with kids being transitioned and stuff, I need to be able to speak. And I would argue that I need to be able to speak the name of the father as well. So that again, it worked out just perfect the way the things sort of laid down to sort of set me up to illustrate, you know, just how Orwellian what is going on is. And when I delivered that line about a totalitarian state forcing its citizens to speak a lie, you could see that hit the judge. Okay, he stopped looking at me and he was looking down, and it was like he was really sort of, yeah, that's really kind of a good point, but he never really addressed it. But I could see it sort of hit him. And then I basically went on to sort of nitpick some of these details about whether or not Facebook really constitutes publication, and whether or not we have a right to be discussing this amongst ourselves. Of course, everything was dismissed. And then I don't know. That's about it. I think I gave a fairly good presentation. It was my version of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, except it was Jenn Smith Goes to the Supreme Court. But it was to no avail. But the thing is that when you look at sort of the bigger implications and the fact that I argued that my charter rights were being violated, right? My right to freedom of speech, my right to freedom of expression, right? In this case, my right to speak the name of somebody I know, right? I've never argued to speak the child's name in this case, only to speak the name of Clark, because I've developed a relationship with Clark. I know him. He's a human being to me, and we're working together on this. So I believe I have a right to use his name in a public forum especially in British Columbia, because this is of interest to everybody in BC. There are implications to what is going on right now. So I made a strong presentation arguing for the right of particularly public activists such as myself, who are trying to affect policy, that we have a right to bring important facts to the public. Well, he didn't agree with that, and he issued the order basically requiring me to remove the Facebook posts in question, forbidding me from providing any links to any material or videos that name the doctors. Now, the doctors is actually an interesting thing, because whereas the child you can kind of understand, the doctors are a whole separate issue. With the doctors, the publication ban forbidding using their names was granted because they claimed that they had received some sort of death threats online. I think it was on the Federalist article or something in the United States, or all kinds of people saying that the doctors, should be beaten up or killed or something like that. The typical stuff that you'll see online. Of course, this is in the States. When I sort of reiterated that, we all get, anybody in this debate, especially on our side. The other side's usually got it pretty good, right? It's our side of the debate who really gets the insults and the physical threats and worse. And in my case, it tends to come not from people in the States. It comes from people right here, right where I'm going. So when I was going to UBC, there was somebody who lived down by UBC asking why I was still able to walk. Why I was still able to, walk to these events and stuff, and that somebody had to arrange for it so that I'm no longer able to walk, right? And that's that's right here, right now, and it's a place that I'm going to. Had the same thing happen in Campbell River, where I was going to talk in Campbell River, and there was someone there saying that I should be exterminated, right? This is a, immediate local thing, whereas in this other, with the case of these doctors, it's who knows where the people are who were making threats. But I've been getting threats of physical violence and even being killed almost for 3 years now, and I'm still here, I'm still walking, and I'm still talking, so nobody's followed through on it, right? Just kind of goes with the territory. But they use these sort of specious threats from people on the internet to say, okay, well, this is why we need to protect these doctors, just to protect their safety, right? But I reject that, because they are also, they're not just doctors. This was the other thing that I tried to clarify for the court. As I said, that the other side here is trying to portray these two doctors as these meek little family practitioners who just work in their office and mind their own businesses and stuff. But that's not what these two doctors are. Both of these two doctors give public talks and give advice, and I would argue push for specific policies and treatments and stuff in this debate. So they are public activists, especially who writes books on especially the wrong doctor. Did I misspeak myself? Boy, I tell you, this is the automatic thing. This is sort of the insidious aspect of this, is they say you can't speak the names of these people, even though they're there in your brain. I mean, what does your brain want to do when you're talking, right? It speaks what it defaults to speaking what it knows. Like if you had to analyze every word in your head before you spoke it, like the conversation would take forever. So there's an autopilot thing that goes on there. In any case, everybody on my Facebook knows the name of particularly the one doctor. And this doctor has written books and advocated for public policy. And I'm on the other side of this debate. I need to be able to name this doctor. I need to be able to talk about him. My argument is people need to know who he is and what he is doing and why that is wrong. But they don't want me to be allowed to speak that. They can tell me, right? They can tell me that I can't do that on social media or in digital media. And the only reason I can do my very, very best, like maybe the lawyers are scrambling because I've made a few mistakes here this evening, and they're scrambling to try to get me shut down. I need to be able to speak the names of these doctors because this is a huge public interest item and issue. And I need to be able to explore that in a full way. And when I'm talking about the foster kids issue, for instance, it's important that I be able to talk about the doctor who has released the information that alarmed me so much. And this gets us to another interesting thing. So part of my, it's not really a defense, but kind of a defense, part of my defense to the judge there was that, you see, this is what happens when a court orders you not to say something or not to speak a truth. You're forced to stop, right? And that interrupts the flow of communication. And I talked about this with the whole pronouns thing, right? And that I've been involved in this debate so much, or addressing the pronouns thing has become an issue. And because everybody's screaming about pronouns all the time, it's done something to my brain. So I was writing a letter to a lawyer, and I was referencing somebody in the letter who was male, was always identified as male, never identified as anything else. But when I was writing the letter, I said, and he argued that, but then my brain stopped me, right? My brain stopped me right there and says, well, go back a few words, he. Are you sure that's the right pronoun? Are you sure that's 100% sure that you should be using he? So it's interfering with the flow of thought and my ability to speak or write. Okay, so I was a creative writer when I was younger, and I have been sort of a more scholarly writer since I went into university. And good writing is about getting into a flow, right? You got to get your brain into a certain state to be able to allow the words to sort of flow out of you. And good writing has sort of an emotional power behind it too. And to really make those two things work together, they have to be united, they have to flow, and anything that interrupts that process is going to harm your ability to do what you're doing as well as you can. It sort of reminds me of the scene in the movie The Shining.
Hi, hon. How's it going?
Fine.
Get a lot written today?
Yes. Wendy, let me explain something to you. Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me. And it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
Yeah.
Fine. And we're gonna make a new rule. Whenever I'm in here, you hear me typing, whether you don't hear me typing, what the f you hear me doing in here, when I'm in here, that means that I am working. That means don't come in. How do you think you can handle that?
So that's just of course, that went to sort of psychotic levels, but that's just sort of talking about a real thing with writers, right? That once you get into a flow, you got to go with that flow. You got to work with that flow. And if anything interrupts it, boom, gone. But that's what's been happening with this whole pronoun thing. Every time I'm using he or she or him, I keep stopping on it. It's like, okay, him, right? Okay, this, yeah, that's the right pronoun. Or why did I even stop? So you see what it's doing to us as human beings, forcing us to speak lies. And that's why initially when I entered this debate, I started playing, like I played along with the pronoun game because I didn't think it really mattered. I mean, when I was younger, and particularly when I was doing transgender sex work, I dealt with a lot of guys, and a lot of these guys had like this deep sort of internal emotional need to refer to me as she and her and as a woman. And it was sort of a private thing though between us, but they had this need to do that. So when I got into this debate, I had dealt with that in the past, and I just sort of like, okay, so whatever, no big deal. We'll just let them use whatever pronouns they want. I don't need those pronouns, but if that's what they want to do, fine. But of course, as we got into this debate and I started dealing with the issue more and more, the whole sort of use of language in this debate started really coming home to me in terms of the implications, not just, for instance, the power of a totalitarian state to force you to speak something you know isn't true, but also the way that it interferes with the functioning of the brain, and specifically in terms of creative writing, right? It has really affected my creative writing. Too often I have to get sort of snagged up on pronouns. So this is an assault on human language as much as it is an assault on other things too. So yeah, I mean, like I say, one of the things I argued was that the other side wants to sort of diminish who these people are. Okay, they're public policy activists as much as I am, right? So I'm on the other side of the debate, and what we have is them over on the pharmaceutical medical complex side of the debate. They are being allowed to take away my best arguments, right? And the judge was saying that, oh, you can still talk about the case. You just can't link the name of the father to the case, right? But this is the other side essentially disarming me, because what they're doing here by doing that, and their primary justification is that if we identify the doctors, somehow this might, and this was a real interesting moment for me. So I questioned, I said, so I don't understand beyond the whole death threat thing, which I get all the time and I'm still alive. So I don't think that's kind of a weak argument. But beyond that, I don't understand why I can't name the doctors when it's so important to what I'm doing. I've tried to explain to you already, and I pointed out the 7.7% of all foster kids in BC are under the care of this one doctor, right? I said, this is important. I need to talk about this, and I need to be able to illustrate who he is. But the judge ultimately fell back on the suggestion that by naming this doctor, somehow somebody somewhere would be able to connect the dots and identify the teenage transgender person in this case. And so I said, well, you see, I don't understand that. Like, I don't understand how naming the doctor is somehow going to expose the child, right? And that caused him some trouble. Right, he sort of wavered for a moment, and then he said, well, you know, I don't know, just things happen, and it could happen. And then he looked down at his paper, and he didn't want to address that anymore. So he didn't want to deal with that. And so that's your other indication here that we have what I call establishment agenda going on. And I really do believe this. I can't prove this, but I really do believe that these judges who have been handling this case have been past secret memos behind the scenes. I'm convinced of that. To understand the fact that this is an establishment agenda, for instance, the lawyer on the other side of this, or one of the lawyers on the other side of this debate, we had lawyers in there standing against us who represented both of the doctors, allegedly represented the child, and the child, by extension, the child's mother, and there was a lawyer representing the BC government, basically. So they had this whole team assembled. Yeah, I argued that because of these numbers, and I put these numbers on basically on the record for him. And this is going to get to my discussion of the media in a second. So I illustrated for him. I said, best estimates are that 1 in 200 people in British Columbia are transgender or identify as transgender. 1 in 200. So that's about 0.5%. What we know about the doctor in question, who I am talking about, and I believe should be the subject of an inquiry, is that by his own admission, and presuming the information that he has given to the public is correct, 7.7% of all of the children in British Columbia are basically identifying as transgender and under the care of this one doctor. Okay, so in the general population, 0.5% of these foster kids, 7.7% of all the kids in the government's care are under the care of this gender doctor. One doctor. There's lots of other doctors who deal with this. How many foster kids are identifying as transgender? It is reasonable to say that it might be as high as 1 in 10. And I said, so this is why I regard this as a matter of urgent public interest. And I have to be allowed to speak about this and to speak about these doctors in order to do my job the best that I can. But that was hand-waved away. Well, you can still talk about it. You just can't mention any names and stuff. But that's because everything they're doing is favoring the medical pharmaceutical government establishment side of the agenda, right? So they, even if I make perfect sense and make a perfect argument, they have to just basically wipe that away. But again, to understand that this is an establishment agenda, the lawyer that allegedly represents the teenager is Barbara Findlay. And Barbara Findlay was also, we've got video of Barbara Findlay working with the SOGI 123 people and giving sort of legal advice and arguments in terms of supporting SOGI 123, okay? And then when this case with the father breaks out, she becomes the lawyer that represents the child in this case. So there's your links there, and sort of pointing to the fact that this is an establishment agenda, right? And they're sort of on everything that relates to this agenda. And so when we see the court and the judge basically sweeping away due process and sweeping away my right to seek counsel before an order is made against me, that's where you get to see that what we have happening here is an establishment agenda, which I have been arguing since day one. Okay, and you also need to understand what the establishment is. And one of my frustrations with people who actually sort of agree with me on the right side of the spectrum is they want to keep saying it's an evil leftist agenda. Okay, it's not an evil leftist agenda. It's coming from the top. Okay, it's coming from the top down, from the highest regions of society. And in Western culture, it is not full of Marxists. I'm sorry, it's just not true. Okay. These corporate lawyers and corporate CEOs and all of these people who have been pushing this are not Marxists. But all of that was dismissed. Yes, they say I can talk about doctors as long as I don't talk about it in relation to the specific case. But again, as I was saying, and my message to the lawyers out there who are watching is that you can silence me on social media. Okay, you can silence me on YouTube. You can get orders against me to prevent me from speaking on digital and social media. But outside of social media, when I'm on the street, in every other way that I can communicate, I will be speaking the Father's name, and I will be speaking the doctor's names. And nobody will stop me. There's too much public interest at stake here. The lives of these foster kids are at stake here. Okay? So I will concede to what you have ordered of me on social media. But outside of social media, you will not stop me from speaking the truth and speaking what I think is important, no matter what. So I want that to be clear, okay? Because some people, this is a credibility issue. So a lot of people are saying, well, because I'm sort of acquiescing here and not speaking all of the details openly and truthfully, that I have surrendered to the power of the state, and so I've lost some sort of moral authority or something. That's not the case. Okay, the case is that they can shut down my ability to communicate, period. Right? That's the only reason I'm complying at that level. But outside of that level, on the street, I'm not going to comply at all. Okay, the only thing they can do to me, say I get a banner and I post let's say, actually, I think I want to do this. I'll get some people together. We'll get a banner made talking about some of the doctors involved in this, and some stats. We'll make a huge banner. We'll hang it above the freeway, and then all the cars going by can see what it says. Right? People need to know about that. This is my argument. Right? It's not just to be malicious. It's because I need people to know, and I need people to know what's going on in order to bring pressure upon the government to get these inquiries that I want. So, yeah, that was what happened with the case, and the fact that they made it so that I'm not even allowed to link to my own work. I'm not allowed to link to my own work. It's crazy. And I'm not allowed to talk to newspapers using those names and stuff either. Not that many newspapers will listen to me anyway. I did have, like I say, Carrie Simpson was very helpful to me, and I did a couple of interviews with Carrie, although I see she hasn't published the second half of that interview. Okay, let's take a look at what people are saying.